Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette, where we find a random philosophy paper, read and review it. So, hope everyone had a good day. Things are just as weird as they normally have been in New York today. They are consistently strange nowadays. Let's see what we got. Archive for Mathematical Asian Bioethics Review. Why have non-communicable diseases been left behind? I don't know, it could do one of these. I don't know if it's let's see, let's just see what we got when I click on it. It's 13 pages. This one is a busted page. It looks like 2 pages. Well, let's see what happens here. Is it really? Yeah, because I got fooled this morning. Something was said it was 7 pages. It was 24 pages. I was like, I can't handle that. All right, that one's not available. Let's see. I don't want to do big data because if I have to read lots of data, it's no fun. Big data. There's a whole thing on big data. All right, I'm tired of big data. Can't handle big data because big data is it's hard to read for me to read technical material out loud. I also can't read much in terms of Spanish. Well, I can read it. I don't know what it would say. I do know how to read the Spanish. All right, cognition. What is this? The limited role of cognitive capacity and future time perspective. All right, we've done a bunch of like future and past stuff, but hey, why not? If we got one more, let's see. How long is this actually? We'll find out very quickly. Oh, it's in HTML? No. Continuing positivity effects? No, this is not it. Okay. So not what I was expecting, but we check out cognition in general. Oh well. No. Critical Horizons. I don't know that journal. Let's find out what they got. Ascent as a review. Multiculturalism and recognition of the other. Charles Taylor's political philosophy. Beyond secular borders. Habermas communicative ethics. And the need for post-secular understanding. That's 15 pages. I'm get something a little shorter. 15 pages. 10 pages toward a critical theory of cultural pragmatics. The Márkus Road. Let's find out what the Márkus Road is, if we can. Hooray! Okay. So, this is what it's gonna be. And if you're in the chat, you can type in exclamation point paper, and you'll get to this page where you can just click around here or whatever and get the paper. So, is it actually what they said in how many pages? 1 of 13. Okay, that's reasonable. And we're off. No abstract. Márkus I don't know how to say Marcus in this case. Marcus' post-Budapest writing on culture were devoted to a single work. For more than 30 years, it finally remained incomplete at the time of his death in 2016. At the core of this work was his renovation of Marx's paradigm of production aimed at non-reductive theory of culture. For him, this was vital both for contemporary critical theory and its contribution to theoretical and political self-reflection on modern democratic capitalist societies. Marcus maintained that the Marxian paradigm of production had conceptual capacity to provide a successful articulation of autonomous cultural relations concentrated in the value spheres of science, art, and philosophy. He considered these cultural values and relations as a key engine room for the possibility of critical self-reflection and individual freedom. His unfinished theory of culture allows us to glimpse the promise of a non-reductive Marxism, a more articulate and penetrating understanding of modern society, a signpost in a direction not yet fully explored in contemporary critical theory. Okay, sounds like an awful lot of stuff to cover in 11 pages. To outline Marcus's envisaged theory of modern autonomous culture, the paper shall locate this approach in the history of Marxism from which it directly emerged. Marcus distinguishes three ways of conceptualizing culture in Marx that are often combined. These are 1. Base and superstructure, 2. The notion of ideology, 3. Cultural production. Having elaborated the relative strengths and weaknesses in these three approaches, anchored in Marx, I show why Marcus favored the third as the best option. 4. The option favored by him is now analyzed by carefully reconstructing his critiques of the author and the subject in the work of Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. The substance of this critique is to demonstrate the historical weaknesses in their account of the death of the subject. 5. To take into account the work of later Foucault that predates Marcus' paper, Creating the Creator, we follow Foucault's later theory of governmentality and consider the persistent failures to fully historicize even the last phase of his work. 6. Conclusion. The general framework, direction, and features of Marcus' own theory of culture are brought into view. Okay. Base and superstructure, stressing the necessary depends of all political, legal, and religious practices upon the economic structure and processes of society. This metaphor proposes both constraining and motivating roles of economic forms in respect to the transformation in the superstructural domain. It has an especially polemic intention. Marx wanted to overturn the prevalent view that these superstructural elements were the expression of general interests of universal value divorced from the economy, allegedly concerned merely with private interests. While the idea of the conditioning of the superstructure by the base was initially a relatively novel insight, it now has lost its critical power as modern culture has been understood in more historical terms. Moreover, this metaphor is typically reductionist because its domination by material, economic, and social factors seems to undercut the possibility of an active interaction between the superstructure and the material base. Marcus makes the point that what represents a genuine critical and practical insight today rests upon how this relation is actually understood. The notion of the superstructure is not sufficiently differentiated to explain how these various cultural institutions and practices actually interact across the whole range of its imbrications. Big word, imbrications. Haven't seen that one in a while. The famous metaphor seems to conceive only a single dichotomy between expressing and suppressing definite interests. In order to articulate the idea of the relative autonomy of culture, a theory of culture needs to be able to indicate not only from what, but also to do what, so that it is autonomous in a given form of practice. In other words, to explain the exact character of the active interaction between the superstructure and the material base. The base superstructure dichotomy lacks precisely this capacity. The sui generis cultural practices and institutions cannot be clearly understood in their detailed interaction. Okay, so we've got this setup where the superstructure and the base. So we've got the economic and the material is separated from how the material is actively how things interact with each other. So if you need to have instead of just having like the class structure, I guess, of like things on top and the way it works, the interactions are also important. And so it's not just that one thing is acting in some way, whatever it might be it economic or social factors, but how it acts actually needs to be taken into consideration. Okay. The notion of ideology. The concept of ideology found throughout Marx's over. I should learn how to say that better. I think it's over. But more frequently in his earlier works derives from his polemical desire to reduce ideas that have been ascribed with transcendental power to well-defined particular conscious and unconscious social interests. The Marxian concept of ideology provides an effective method of demasking the social origins of various superstructural ideas that are actually determined by material interests. Marx goes even further by revealing the ultimate methodological premises of the most significant works of high culture and science as conditioned by such unreflexive prejudgments which remain in the contradictions and fractures of these key works. This becomes a key element of a critique of society whose dominant culture systematically precludes the understanding of alternative social possibilities being created. While Marcus acknowledges the central role played by the critique of ideology, especially in the tradition of Western Marxism, he suggests that Marx already pointed to the limitations of the critique of ideology. First, the problem of the genesis and specific function of the basic cultural forms. How does ideology play out, if at all, in the determination of specific genres? How does ideology explain the specificity of poetry or the novel? The second issue relates to the question of cultural traditions, their original creation and reception. These key cultural institutions like patronage endured long after the social and historical conditions that had supported them had disappeared. These two problems appear to be interconnected. Enduring effective traditions and genres are not found in the same location. Some genres are entirely unknown in particular cultural traditions, for example, realist painting in the European tradition but not in the Muslim world during the same period. Certainly later thinkers in the broad Western Marxian canon, George Lukács, Theodore W. Adorno, Raymond Williams, attempted to address these issues in particular cultural genres, the novel, music, and drama. However, these limitations of Marx's theory of culture remained unanswered in their generality. Okay, so we've got like ideological foundations that also need to be, I guess, maybe historicized or better understood here in terms of how the interaction goes on. Okay, let's find out. Marcus argues that attempts to address these problems are found in the history of Marx's reception. History, okay. Herbert Marcuse resorted to an ahistorical anthropology in the late 1930s, while Marx himself had already offered a romanticizing historicism, history as a living memory of humanity, in his early work. Both of these approaches sit oddly with the mature Marxist strong historicism. The fact that some historical residues of the past remain so actively in the present demonstrate fundamental changes both in the stock of effective tradition and in the very structure of the culturally codified genres and classification. Yeah, you end up with this is a point that comes up, at least I like this point. The classifications of the older systems, those get passed down over and over time, and so you inherit those and you start thinking with them, and then they get like ingrained into like algorithms and books and everywhere, and then you're stuck with these old ideas that were culturally codified at some time before you were ever alive, usually. Despite these lapses in historical accuracy and knowledge, Marcus still views these two alternative answers as symptoms of a healthy self-defense. Both strategies retreat from real history as a protection against the very idea of the cancer of a total critique of ideology. Okay. The danger of this form of critique is that its will to emancipation necessarily claims a privileged position in relation to the social objects being criticized. The inevitable consequence of such a claimed privileged position is to render some of those examined existing presuppositions and prejudgments as opaque or unconscious to the recipient. Yeah. So, such a total theory of culture has two clear implications. Either the critic maintains her own standpoint is in principle free from any historically constraining perspectivity, and therefore places herself outside the existing cultural tradition, or she must acknowledge herself embedded in the same historically distorted conditions. These limitations can be reflectively recognized but never transcended. Marcus maintains that the later Marx had adopted the former position and had come to understand his own theory on the model of the natural sciences. This position is unsatisfactory in light of the contemporary philosophy of science, which rejects the positivistic self-understanding. On the other hand, the latter alternative has even more dubious results. If critique acknowledges its historical context as something rationally untranscendable, then and as a fundamental aspect of human finitude, this collapses into a complete relativism that sacrifices its capacity to maintain a measure of value and loses critique's practical social relevance. Okay, so if you can't get out of the stuff, if you're stuck in the old ways of thinking and you can't get out of them, then you're gonna be in some sort of relativistic situation. Okay. The concept of cultural production. Let's see, how long am I going? Okay. Concept of cultural production. The concept of cultural production appears throughout Marx's writing, but is never completely clarified. Okay, so this is where we're getting somewhere now. Like, how does things actually act in the world? Its more recent popularity stems from a changed perception of culture, which, unlike an older version of culture, was inextricably linked to the individual artistic genius and the domain of universal values. Today's world has become globalized and democratized and embraces a much greater knowledge of the other. At the same time, modern culture has also become more mundane, the product of social manufacturing of various types determined by the changing tastes and choices of the modern consumer. For Marx, the notion of cultural production at least connotes the extinction of the realm of culture and its sui generis activities. It follows from this more mundane conception that the social function of these cultural practices is determined by their historically changing places in the overall division of labor. As a result, it is necessary to inquire into the institutional mechanisms through which they are interconnected and integrated. At this point, Marcus signals another aspect of the concept of cultural production that has a much more contentious role. Let me see if I got all of that. Yeah, okay. For Marcus, there can be no doubt that cultural production is not confined to instrumental, goal-rational activities, and the specificity of these cultural activities need to be captured. This requires some determinate conceptual distinctions and insights that demarcate the specific cultural dimension of such institutional practices. Alright, so how do you think about what you're doing matters and what you're doing? Marcus turns to the later post-Marxian use of the concept of cultural production. Such analyses were insightful regarding the domain of mass culture, where genuine commercialization of these objects and practices was characteristic. However, these analyses were less successful in the domain of high culture, where its autonomy was constitutive institutional characteristic of modernity. So tell me, it was a constitutive institutional characteristic of modernity. Another approach, characteristic of Adorno and Benjamin, was to employ the distinction between productive forces and relations of production in the analysis of modern art. For Marcus, is this Marcuse? No, Marcus. For Marcus, both of these approaches emphasize predominantly the social relations and institutions pertaining to the sphere of culture. This emphasis ensures its integration in the total process of social reproduction as a whole. However, this same emphasis between social relations and cultural relations are not sufficiently specific to also illuminate relations and interactions within the realm of high culture. In order to reconfigure the concept of cultural production in a way that makes the most sense of the autonomy of modern culture, Marcus argues that the paradigm of production needs to minimize the notion of reproduction as the key moment of cultural production. If modern high culture rests upon the principle of innovation and novelty, its emphasis must shift to acts of creation rather than reproduction within an existing mode of production. This tension between reproduction and innovation was already signaled by Marx. He refers to these cultural activities as Geist or ideal objectivations. Objectivations. Okay, never seen this word before. He also understands the necessity of reproduction and that use values must always be used up and constantly remade or refreshed to renovate the human social world. What especially differentiates cultural works is that they are products of mental labor and fulfill their intended cultural functions primarily as meaning complexes that are conserved by further acts of understanding and reception within social institutions. Okay, so we've got these innovation is to resist reproduction here. And then the institutions are the ones that understand this in some sense. Okay. In this sense, the notion of ideal cultural production makes these products objectless, and their production lacks a strict meaning. Yeah, because it's a sort of a negative. It's a innovation is a resistance to reproduction, the novelty, creation rather than reproduction. Okay. So, it is precisely this difference that allows one to think of cultural practices as a sphere of social reproduction. Such works only retain their cultural significance as long as they are continually repeated in acts of proper reception, which is immanent and relevant to them. Without this, the same works are simply dead historical documents. The immanent meanings of the full range of cultural values are always being modified in history. Their meanings are only living while they are posited and understood within a given silently assumed context of systematic relations that is constantly reproduced with its specific articulations and subdivisions. Okay, so the works of art themselves are these creations that resist reproduction, but what they're really producing is something in the social world. So the social reproduction of whoever the institutional or the art high art world is repeatedly acting in the same way with respect to them, and that's where the reproduction is. It's producing something in the art world, not of itself, where is the location of the reproduction. Okay, that's interesting. The importance of these systematic cultural relations and subdivisions becomes obvious when one considers the question of innovation as a specific feature of modern high culture. For authors and recipients, each various sphere of cultural practice and its specific institutional content are broadly already given. What constitutes innovation will depend upon what the effective tradition, say in regard to Impressionist art in the late 19th century, and in what respects in terms of which, according to such criteria, a specific work ought to be novel, say the meaning of replication in the natural science or art. Moreover, these relevant criteria are different in particular genres. These are specific sui generis cultural relations constituting the sphere of autonomous culture in its basic subdivisions and articulations. They offer normative relations to various imputed authors and their proper publics. These are characterized by some specific demanded attitude towards the cultural objects. This supposes the recipient should be able to reproduce the content of work by demonstrating its understanding in certain ways. Thus, cultural forms are coagulated cultural relations present in the structure and organization of the work in question. These forms define the range of admissible modalities of meaningful cultural objectifications within a definite epoch. They constitute an institutionalized pragmatics which circumscribe the plurality of positions and perspectives from which the recipient can ascribe its meaning and intelligibility to its world. Okay, so this is just going back over this stuff from before. The art somehow amalgamates, and they say coagulates, some sort of public to the art viewing public, or the important art viewing public, and creates a social reaction in that public. That's where it's getting reproduced. It's reproducing the social reaction in the art viewing public, the art world maybe, and see, proper publics here. So we got the proper publics up here, and it's the imputed authors. So the authors somehow coagulate cultural relations of the proper publics in the art, and that's where the reproduction is made. Is actually the target of the art is the public, the target public, and that's where it's getting reproduced. Okay. The field of modern cultural relations are both enabling and constraining. Ascriptively fixed in more traditional societies, these cultural forms and relations are now in principle open to all with their claims to universality and to autonomy. Under modern conditions, works of culture are not addressed to specific sociological determinate publics, but are only distributed by homogenized market mechanisms. Yeah, it is kind of sad that this is the case. In modern conditions, differences are simply matters of taste in existing structures of social power. These differentiated systems of cultural form lead to a wide range of normative author-work relations linked to the present social functions. How music or science will be understood depends upon how these normative relations are practiced at a given time. There are always ongoing struggles within the realms of autonomous culture. Cultural values and forms exist in tension and always evolving, say the role of science or religion. These are issues of demarcation, continually debate, and social pressure impacts. These are issues of demarcation continually debated, or these are, I don't know, let's go with these issues of demarcation continually debated and social pressure impacts upon the various modalities of meaning as expressed and understood within the spheres of culture. Márkus points to a good example of such constant struggle. The idea of the norm of system in the genre of philosophy is evoked in the rise and fall in this genre in the history of philosophy. Its early modern attempts to exercise its full emancipation from subordination to institutionalized religion and theology, and to resist its decline under the pressure from scientization and deconstruction from other professional social quarters. However, the autonomy of culture does not mean its very subsystems and genres have logics of their own. Transformations in the practices of high culture and their objectivity are decisively influenced by the demands and pressures emanating from other external domains of social life and the new possibilities connected to their material base. Well, that's fine. I mean, you're just sort of each modality or every little bit of the world, I guess you could say, it has its sort of like work of art that you might consider, and each of those has that target audience, and so there's different forces going on because, you know, this is a philosophy paper, but it's also a work of like writing, and I mean, I'm performing it in some sense, so all these things interact, and there's going to be pushing from different sides, but that's not, yeah, you could say the cultural relations are both enabling and constraining. That's fine. This is just sort of limiting or showing what's pushing and pulling on different sorts of stuff over time. That's okay. Márkus' theory of culture straddles both his deep investment in and knowledge of the Marxian heritage and his view that this legacy needs to be radically historicized. On the one hand, the socio-economic system only provides a stable framework for the sustained reproduction for existing cultural practices. On the other hand, a historicizing perspective draws attention to the autonomous workings of culture, underlying that the modern concept and system of the arts predated the modern capitalist market and was anchored in the more traditional relations of patronage and guild organization. This demonstrates that the existing capitalist social economic system depends to a key pre-capitalist institutions and relations. At the same time, cultural products like books and theater performances played a pioneering role in commodification and marketization. Such significant cultural transformations are just as much preconditions as consequences of major structural social change. Modern cultural elements and relations are for Márkus not just foundations, but are also active agents of transformation. Okay, so how this stuff is all understood, and the like public, really, the point here is, I guess, the public is changing over time, and it's been changing like this, like the target public of philosophy. Of course, philosophy has been around forever. Now, so the target public, of course, is a different thing, and some of the, I guess the point here is that a lot of what we are taking to be the modern, like, Marxist struggle, or what the given Marxist struggle is really comes from pre-capitalist social economic systems, and that's really, the public was determined by those works of art. It was a different sort of system that determined the public that doesn't any longer exist, but we're still using the cultural heritage from those times that was directed at a culture that that no longer exists, but did produce certain sorts of forms of interaction, say like reading a novel, which is a certain sort of form of interaction. Okay, so we're defined by how we interact with the world, and so yeah, so active agents of transformation. So just because, and so how we interact with the like works of art is how it's a part of the transformation of our society and culture. Okay, I think I'm getting this. Not really my area, but I'm trying. Creating the creator and the death of the subject. We have already seen that the author is one of the key elements of Márkus's cultural pragmatics, along with the text and the reader. We shall now consider how he deals with two important rival theorists who propose an anti-humanist interpretation of these relations of cultural pragmatics and explore Márkus's critique of both. It is not surprising that Márkus would be interested in the development of structuralist theories of literary theory, anthropology, linguistics, philosophy of science, and philosophy. These theories proclaim new ideas of the death of the subject and the death of the author, and in doing so threaten to annihilate the grounds upon which an old humanism had staked out in the specificity of culture. While Márkus turned to a defense of the cultural function of the author and the subject in his quest to rescue the autonomy of culture, he positions himself as more truly the historicist than either Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, whose death of the author contributed to the desensitization of their own generation to the critical specificity of modern culture. Okay. Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes announced the death of the subject in 1968 in a now famous paper. While today the idea of authorship is a socially and culturally recognized function, at the time Barthes wanted to challenge the romantic view of the author as a genius. From the outset there is a certain logical ambiguity in Barthes' standpoint. He both questions the existence of any personal authorial voice since the historical emergence of writing, while at the same time demands its liquidation. Both these propositions seem to be quite reasonable. Writing as a social objectivation presupposes an existence that is independent from the intentional subject. Equally, modern literature employs a strategy that promotes authorial impersonality. Towards the end of his paper, Barthes announced the birth of the reader as the site of the unity of the text. This sits rather oddly with the fact that Barthes also denies the very possibility of such a unity. Aside from this theoretical ambiguity, Márkus also points to some historical inadequacies in Barthes' standpoint. While Barthes acknowledges the need to historicize the concept of the author, this is achieved in a completely untenable way. Foucault argues that this insistence that the concept of the author expresses the individualist ideology of capitalism. Okay, this is a rather odd assertion. This is a rather odd assertion, flies in the face of the several well-known pre-capitalist articulations of the notion of the author. He also misunderstands the traditional conventions of the modern novel. The fictitious omniscient narrator is a fundamental presupposition of literary realism that invites descriptions and evaluations to be true. Such key devices cannot be dismissed. Barthes also offers a problematic understanding of J.A. Austen and his notion of performatives. These were meant to be speech acts that are sentences not which only describe a given reality, but also change the social reality they are describing. Austen was primarily interested in the conditions under which a performative speech act could misfire in the sense of an illegitimate or inappropriate utterance. These performatives reveal that an act depends upon the capabilities and socially recognized competencies of the relevant agent. In Barthes' hands, these performatives are transformed into the linguistic equivalents of Cartesian eternal truths, where performatives are entirely empty and without any relation to actual interlocutors. Barthes has leached out the social and subjective core of language. Performatives become an empty process a la Heidegger rather than those of the analytic tradition. Okay, I don't know enough Barthes to really comment on this, but this seems like a very impressive last sentence, to tell you the truth, if you can say something about performatives, Heidegger, and the analytic tradition all at once. But okay, maybe it was it's over my head right there. Sure. Michel Foucault. For Márkus, Foucault was the more important thinker whose tremendous impact on philosophy and the critical theory tradition has to be acknowledged. Foucault accepts Barthes' fundamental post-structuralist presuppositions, the rejection of the humanist notion of the subject, and its particular version of intertextuality. Affirming Barthes' famous death of the author, Foucault also agrees with him in ascribing a limited, excluding role to authorship and confirms that the basic tendency of modern literature was towards the total effacement of the individual characteristics of the writer. However, Foucault offers a much more sociological sociologically elaborate version of Barthes' death of the author. To do this, he must contest Barthes' most important assumptions. In particular, Foucault assumes a clear connection between authorship and performativity. The author cannot be described in purely linguistic terms. For Foucault, Barthes transposes the empirical characteristics of the author into a form of transcendental anonymity, and thereby has re-sacralized and mystifies creativity and restored religious beliefs into a fixed and continuous tradition. To Foucault's mind, Barthes' retreat from history offers legitimacy to capitalism with its postulate of free and rational subject, which sanctions the liberal state and impersonal mechanisms of the market. For Foucault, the question of authorship also has a much broader and practical implications beyond critical reflection upon literary theory or the humanities in general. For Márkus, the theoretical shortcoming of Barthes' famous essay has reduced it to the status of a historical document. Foucault's work, by contrast, maintains its relevance to us. Clearly, the historicizing moment in Foucault is critical for its claimed theoretical innovation and critical thrust. Foucault's main innovation was to take over the author function as a socially constructed historical variable that impacts upon and transforms the reader's attitude and critically transforms both our understanding of such texts and culture in general. The key to this innovation was Foucault's conception of power. However, for Márkus, Foucault's view of power is not sufficiently historical. While Foucault takes power to be historically concrete, discontinuous, and mutating in relation to historical contexts, however, against such clear historical variability, he still wants to view social power as inescapable and impersonal. Such networks of social power always circumscribe the specific resistances internal to it. Márkus finds this notion of impersonal power is the most problematic aspect of Foucault's legacy, but also his significant contribution to critical theory. Foucault's predecessors in the tradition of discursivity, Marx and Freud, had presupposed a humanist conception of the subject that assumes a transhistorical autonomy of the individual, which no power could completely eliminate. For Foucault, this modern subjectivity is not merely illusory, it is also the socio-cultural site of subjugation to the concrete bodily individual. This traditional adherence to humanism legitimates the oppressive social power of the modern disciplinary society. Whatever critical insights follow from Foucault's tenacious pursuit of unacknowledged relations of power, Márkus finds crucial historical failures in the historicizing intentions of Foucault's theory of power. In contrast to Marx, Foucault is unable to fully articulate hierarchical social and economic relations that are irreducible to anonymous power relations. These social and economic relations are typically hierarchical, but also in some important respects mutual and cooperative. While these personal relations can be coercive, they are not so unilaterally. In early Foucault, non-sexual relations are simply divided between those of genuine mutuality, Greek friendship, and those of domination that is unilateral and irresistible. Márkus again mentions the historical importance of relations of patronage that Foucault ignores. To fully historicize his concept of the author, Foucault needed to develop a more nuanced understanding of power that would fully admit its historical specificity and variability. For example, before the rise of the capitalism book market, most artists and writers were socially defined as clients. While Foucault's critique of Marxism successfully exposes previously unacknowledged grids of oppression behind class struggle, it also betrays the problematic character of his own anti-humanism. Marx's humanism, which Márkus endorses, has allowed him to account for a full spectrum of social relationships. He insists that even the most limiting forms of social historical determination and social oppression, the modern individual subject can never be completely liquidated. In all such situations, the actor always has some scope for action determined by personality and actual life history. The later Foucault was certainly trying to move in this direction of finding more theoretical space for subjective, practical political initiative at the time of his death. Okay? Cool. A lot of big words, though. It's very hard to read big words. I'm sorry. This desire to provide theoretical space for work for more practical and political... Let me start again. This desire to provide more... This desire to provide theoretical space for more practical and political initiative is expressed in the last phase of Foucault's work. We only have an unfinished and unpublished fragment of Márkus' work to use. However, the internal evidence of his critique of the early Foucault, like the numeral 1, indicates that his fragment, Creating the Creator, the Author 1, was written in the early 1980s. Márkus's would have certainly also discussed the later Foucault had these works been available to him. In his self-criticism toward the end of his life, recorded in various interviews, Foucault suggested that the work of discipline and punishment period gave too much priority to disciplinary power. He had failed to theorize the way in which the subject constituted itself through certain practices and games of truth. His forward strategy was to shift to a more comprehensive theoretical model of various self-relation that he designated governmentality. Here, government was understood in the broadest possible sense as the totality of strategies and practices whereby individuals regulate their conduct in regard to themselves and others. Foucault's new focus, this idea of governmentality, as a strategic field of power relations characterized by their mobility, transformability, and reversibility, allows his analysis to concentrate on the elements of the subject both theoretically and practically defined by the relationship of self to self, of relation both of oppression but also resistance. Quite simply, this means that in the type of analysis I have been trying to advance for some time, you can see that power relations, governmentality, the government of the self and of others, and the relationship of the self to self constitution, a chain, a thread, and I think it is around these notions, self-constitute a chain, a thread, and I think it is around these notions that we should be able to connect together the question of politics and the question of ethics. This model has several implications. Firstly, Foucault now wanted to prioritize the self-relation over the other relations, like that of strategic relations to others, techniques of government, and includes a notion of domination defined as relations wherein power is asymmetrically fixed. Foucault nominates the former as the care of the self. With this priority to the self-relation, he wants to underscore that an ethics of the self is an urgent, fundamental, and politically indispensable task. Here is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than in the relationship one has to oneself. In this new interpretation of power relations in Foucault's The History of Sexuality, resistance is underscored, the resistance as the inverse of all dispersed, decentered power. The key to this conception of the relationality of power is that neither power nor resistance can be a fundamental substance. Okay. The template of modern power relations became the model of post-68 politics of social movements. For Foucault, this is an explosion of the local, dispersed resistance to the totalizing aspirations of the whole range of institutional authorities in the bureaucracy, universities, schools, hospitals, and prisons. Foucault's ideas gave expression to this new configuration of resistances. However, here his reinterpretation is provided with an extra theoretical blast in the form of Nietzsche's idea of the will to power as a ubiquitous anonymous power in general. While Nietzsche chose to anchor the will to power in a naturalistic Lebensphilosophy in the shape of life itself, Foucault prefers to view it as traversing the social body. Foucault is clearly reluctant to resort to a full-blown metaphysics. Foucault refuses to provide even a general alternative theory of power. He stresses that his ideas on power arose from specific situations and the inadequacy of existing models to explain the historical phenomena before him: madness, prison, sexuality, and truth. Thus, here Foucault wants to maintain his ideas on power on merely the historical level. Okay, almost done. This understanding of the resistance seems to speak to Foucault's biography and his experience in Paris during the post-68 socio-political struggles. However, appealing to Nietzsche's view of power, despite Foucault's own historicizing tendencies, they are now injected with trans-historical significance. This means that even in his late works, Foucault was not willing to fully historicize his vision of social power. Okay. This is especially clear in Foucault's view of all social life as a domain of omniscient power, social life as a force field of asymmetrical power relations, the binary battlefront dominated by purely strategic considerations. For Foucault, this dispersion of anonymous powers presupposed a generalized resistance as the mere other of power. The result of this invariable flux of domination and resistance is that it loses all historical and sociological specificity. Okay. Alright, so an analysis of what happened because of all this. Alright, in conclusion, I have attempted to elaborate the direction indicated by Marcus's unfinished theory of culture. He clearly felt that the Marxist tradition had hitherto failed to give a plausible account of cultural autonomy, and this was vital to a contemporary, self-critical, democratic society. All his efforts were directed towards a general framework of a theory of cultural pragmatics focused on the institutions and relations that would facilitate and enhance his vital self-reflection. His reflections on the autonomy of culture were focused especially on the circle of author's text and reader across the full spectrum of high cultural activities in the sciences, arts, and philosophy. As we have seen, Marcus's strategy here is to radically historicize all social and historical institutions and their underpinning cultural pragmatics. This means that he demands very close empirical and historical investigations around the changing forms and configuration of text, authors, and publics in all various spheres. To my viewers out there, all one of you, if you're even here right now, consider the act of reading philosophy to the Twitch public. This is what I was kind of thinking when I started this program. The live streaming gameplay watching public. So this is my public at the moment. So it's an interesting analysis of this sort of thing, what I'm actually doing right now. As we've seen, Marx's strategy is to radically historicize all social and historical institutions under the underpinning cultural pragmatics. This means that he demands very close empirical and historical investigation around the changing forms and configuration of texts, authors, and publics in all various spheres. Yeah, publics in all various spheres. That's where we are now. Barthes and Foucault serve Marcus as key thinkers who are moving in a more historicizing direction. However, Marcus focuses on the historical simplifications and errors scattered throughout both analyses. For example, he seizes on Foucault's apparent ignorance of the cultural role played by patronage in the transition to modern social and economic conditions. Likewise, Barthes' misinterpretations of Austin of performative utterances fails to recognize the decisive part played by social struggles in history in our understanding of language and its evolution. But for Marcus, Foucault's lack of detailed social and historical specificity points to a residual reliance on trained historical ideas or essences about the general character of power. Against this, Marcus argues that to really understand the autonomy of modern culture, we must remain resolutely focused on the microscopical analysis of real social and historical interactions and the way they change over time. This means that a critical theory must work in harness with these other more specialized historical and social disciplines. Barthes and Foucault went part of the way in this direction, but both fell short. Only this partnership will illuminate the complex two-way interaction between social and economic determinations and the active role of culture, its institutions, and genres. Agnes Heller makes it clear that the death or end of the subject is not a new trope or assertion. She noted that a couple of generations ago, scientific behaviorism rejected the subject as not sufficiently scientific. Today, the problem has inverted to the point where the individual subject has now allegedly created the havoc of science and technology. Just as these changing historical perspectives reveal the essential historicity of such philosophical visions and tropes. With the historical death of the cultural institution of the school as the bearer of philosophy in modern times, it should be no surprise that recent claims to the end of the subject and the author are even more closely linked to the names of particular individual philosophers and their personal visions of the modern world. What is most distinctive in Marcus' general theory of autonomous culture is that philosophy can no longer be conceived as positive knowledge. Connecting evaluation with facts is not a simple matter of inference, but of cogent narrative, which renders the present and the future meaningful as long as we adhere to certain chosen values and courses of action. For Marcus, contemporary critical theory continues to have a major diagnostic function. It can analyze and reconstruct the tradition of the present and also illuminate the normative and factual preconditions of reigning practices and privileges. However, the resulting social diagnosis must forego the presumption to understand the totality. What remains are attempts at totalization, partial and provisional attempts to a whole that can only be constructed within a given culture and remain reliant on the standpoint of existing individuals, their causes, potentials, and chosen values. While this understanding of the diagnostic function allows critical distance from certain taken for granted practical and cognitive assumptions, it remains very much constrained. Marcus sought to quite consciously to deflate the traditional totalizing aspirations of previous generations of philosophy. However, he again and again underscores the importance of history and empirical knowledge towards a comprehensive understanding of cultural dynamics. To follow his lead may be especially arduous for the philosophical tradition and its generalization, but it is still a live option, a road that remains open. Well, this is fun. I definitely don't have enough background in this area, but I do sort of get the upshot of we have to understand the public, because this is actually a public philosophy project that I'm doing right here. You are my public wherever you are, and we're in the middle of this social and physical distancing craziness because of the coronavirus, and so this is a product of that sort of situation that you are listening to me right now. And so this might actually be a nice way to look at my own project that I am working on right now and understand it better, because the question of who is the public in public philosophy has been a concern of mine for a while now, and I don't understand it, and I have not seen a good enough analysis of it. And so I do these public philosophy things without a theory in some sense. I have to come up with it myself, and it's hard. It's very hard stuff to do. Maybe I'm going to think more about this, but it's a nice paper. I don't know the history, but it does. I really did like the point about the work of art in the high art area as not as a non-reproducible thing in itself, but reproducing something socially and culturally, and that that cultural product is really what it is, how it reproduces in that public. And so how is philosophy here and other places also reproduced in a cultural public or culture consuming public, and what is it doing for that? So that is a very good point, and something I will continue to think about, because this is concern to me. Okay, have a good day. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, folks, and yeah, hope you enjoyed this. I may take tomorrow off, but I'll be back like in a day or two, because there's nowhere to go and nothing else to do. Just read some philosophy and stay safe. Bye.